Some stories shout to be heard, but the best ones arrive in the quiet. Welcome to Tales from Timber Creek, where every lantern glow, every mountain trail, and even the falling rain has a gentle story to tell. So pull up a chair, sit back, relax. I have a story to tell you. The Longest Trail. The first frost arrived 3 weeks early that autumn, settling across the valley like a white blanket and turning the banks of Willow Creek silver beneath the morning sun. Smoke drifted from scattered chimneys. Cattle called across the open range. It looked like every peaceful morning Clara Morgan had ever known. But nothing about it was peaceful. She sat alone on the weathered porch of the cabin her husband had built with his own hands, a cup of coffee gone cold beside her. The silence was the hardest part, not the kind found deep in the mountains, where birds eventually broke it, but a silence with weight to it, pressing into the empty chair by the fireplace, into every room where two voices had once filled the air. Daniel had been gone 12 days. Some called it fate, others called it God's timing. The doctor simply called it an infection. A scrape across Daniel's palm, received while he repaired a wagon axle for a family heading west. He'd laughed at Clara when she fussed over washing it. It's nothing, he told her, with the crooked smile she'd fallen for 23 years before. I've had worse from blackberry bushes. He kept working while it worsened. The barn roof, the firewood, the fence posts loosened by summer storms. There was never a shortage of work. By the 5th day, the cut had turned red and angry. By the 7th, fever had taken his strength. The nearest doctor rode 30 miles through rough country and arrived with little more than herbs, whiskey, and prayer. 3 mornings later, Clara held Daniel's hand while his breathing slowed. There was no grand speech. He looked toward the window where the sunlight stretched across their little farm and said, "You'll be all right." Then he smiled. "I wish I'd finished the fence." Those words haunted her more than any farewell, because every time she looked outside, there it was, unfinished. The neighbors had been kind. For nearly 2 weeks, they brought casseroles and preserves and comforting words. If you need anything, just send word. And she'd thanked every one of them and meant it. But kindness always goes home eventually. The wagons stopped coming. The footprints faded from the yard. Then it was just Clara and everything Daniel had left behind. She wrote it all down one evening by lantern light, meaning to make sense of it. Feed the chickens, milk Daisy, their cow, repair the north fence, fix the roof before winter, stack 2 more cords of firewood, harvest potatoes, cut hay, clean the chimney, patch the smokehouse, sharpen tools, mend the wagon wheel, salt the pork, check the cellar, fetch water, wash clothes, mend blankets, preserve apples, repair harness leather, pay the feed merchant, clear brush, plant winter rye, and somehow sleep. She stared at the list until the words blurred. Every task looked impossible. Together, they looked fatal. She folded the paper into the drawer and cried harder than she had since the funeral. The next morning began before dawn, the rooster crowing half an hour too early, the way Daniel had always complained it did. She almost smiled. She pulled on his boots. Hers were too thin for the winter ahead, and crossed the yard to where Daisy stood waiting, unimpressed. You've always been his favorite, Clara muttered. The cow answered with a low, annoyed moo. I know. I miss him too. Milking had looked easy when Daniel did it. Her hands cramped before the bucket was half full. The cow shifted, the bucket tipped, and half an hour's work vanished into the dirt. She sat down beside it. I can't even do this, she said, surprised to hear herself say it aloud. Everything took longer than it should have. 2 trips to the creek where Daniel had needed one. A dozen logs before her arms gave out. Doors that fought the swollen hinges. A ladder that felt taller. Hay bales that seemed to have doubled in weight. She wasn't weaker. She simply didn't have another pair of hands, another back, another heart to carry half the load. 3 days later, she tried the fence. Daniel had left the cedar posts and rails stacked and ready, his hammer resting where he'd set it down. She picked it up and held it a long moment, tracing the handle worn smooth by his years of use, almost able to see him beside her, hat tipped back, whistling some tune he never got quite right. Then she raised the hammer. The first nail bent. She missed the second. The third caught her thumb, and she threw the hammer onto the grass. I can't do any of this. Her voice carried across the empty pasture. Only the wind answered. That night she spread the ledgers across the kitchen table. Daniel had always kept the accounts. She knew roughly what they owed and what was owed to them, but roughly wasn't enough, and the numbers seemed to climb every time she added them. What if winter came early? What if the roof caved in before she could fix it? What if Daisy stopped giving milk, or the creek froze, or she got sick with no one to send for the doctor? By midnight, she'd solved nothing and convinced herself of everything. Sleep became one more chore she couldn't manage. Every creak of the roof, every distant coyote, one more problem waiting for morning. 2 weeks passed this way. The strange thing was, she wasn't lazy. She worked harder than she ever had. Yet each evening the place looked worse than the last. The wood still laid scattered. The fence still leaned, and she started 5 jobs a day and finished none of them, like standing in the middle of a river trying to catch every drop with her bare hands. One rainy afternoon, climbing into the loft after dry rope, she found Daniel's old trail map instead, hand-drawn, the margins crowded with his notes. Good trout here. Avoid the marsh after rain. Steep climb. Easy crossing. Daniel had loved trails. He used to say the wilderness taught lessons no classroom could. One route on the map ran farther than all the rest, nearly 100 miles across mountains and rivers, and beside it he'd written only 3 words: the longest trail. She folded the map back up. I don't even know where to begin. The answer came walking up the lane the next morning, leading a mule whose muzzle had gone white with age. The traveler's beard was gray, his boots more traveled than most men's ever were. A bedroll and a fishing pole and a blackened coffee pot slung across the saddle. He studied the broken fence for a moment before he looked toward her. Morning, ma'am. His voice was gentle. You look like someone trying to carry tomorrow before you finish today. Clara managed a tired smile. Yeah, I suppose that shows. It always does. He accepted her offer of coffee without hesitation, tying the mule beneath the cottonwood tree beside the barn. I've learned never to refuse hot coffee, he said. Good coffee and good company are both rarer than most people think. It isn't much company, Clara said. Well, it doesn't have to be, I guess. Inside, morning light spread across the pine table Daniel had built years before. The traveler set his hat beside his cup, a face that had clearly spent more nights under stars than under a roof. My name's Isaiah. I'm Clara. I know. I helped carry your husband's coffin. Neither spoke for a moment. I never knew him well, Isaiah went on, but I'd crossed paths with him enough to know the kind of man he was. He always stopped to help people, Clara said, staring into her coffee. That's how I remember him. That's how he got cut, fixing a stranger's wagon. Something so small. Her voice caught. Isaiah folded his hands. Most storms begin with a single cloud. After breakfast, he asked if he might look around the property. Clara nearly laughed. You'll need the whole day. Well, I've got the whole day. They walked the yard together, Isaiah saying little, taking in the leaning fence, the sagging barn door, a woodpile shrinking faster than winter was arriving, the loose shingles, the overgrown garden, the cracked wagon wheel. He stopped at last beside the fence Daniel had never finished. What worries you most? Clara laughed a little bitterly. Most? It's all of it. The roof leaks. The fence is down. The chickens keep getting loose. I haven't cut enough wood. The potatoes need digging. The wagon won't roll. I don't know if the cellar will last the winter. My accounts are behind. I haven't even cleaned the chimney. She stopped out of breath. The list never ends. Isaiah let the silence sit before he asked one question. Which of those needs doing today? All of them. I didn't ask what eventually needs doing. I asked what has to be done before the sun goes down. She opened her mouth and then closed it and actually thought about it. The cows need feeding. And the chickens, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And what else? She searched the yard for an answer. The roof? It isn't raining. The fence? No cattle have gotten out yet. The firewood, then. Isaiah walked to the stack and looked it over with an experienced eye. You've got enough for another week. When she only stared at him, he said, You've been borrowing tomorrow's worries. That afternoon, he sat on the porch and whittled for the better part of an hour while Clara rushed from task to task. Water, then chickens, then a loose board she noticed on the way, then hay, then a torn harness strap, then weeds in the garden, and by noon, nothing had actually been finished. Isaiah hadn't said a word until he called her over. What have you completed today? She looked around. The answer embarrassed her. Nothing. You've worked hard. Oh, I know. But you haven't finished anything. He took a small leather notebook from his saddlebag, its edges worn smooth from decades on the trail. Inside were hundreds of entries, dates, places, weather, each one strangely short. Crossed creek, repaired saddle strap, reached Cedar Ridge. Where are the long entries? Claire asked. You crossed mountains. You traveled hundreds of miles. I never did, Isaiah said. I only ever walked today. He picked up a stick and drew a long line in the dirt, marking a point at each end. This was the longest trail I ever traveled. Know what defeats most travelers? It's not the distance, it's the thinking. They stand at the start and stare all the way to the end. Every mountain, every river, every blister, and talk themselves out of the first 10 steps. He rubbed out the line until only the first mark remained. But no one walks 100 miles. They walk one step, and then another. The longest trail in the world is nothing but the next step repeated often enough. That evening, Clara took Daniel's list from the drawer and, instead of reading the whole page, folded it down to a single line. Repair one fence post. Not the fence, one post. She dug out the broken cedar, set a new one, packed the earth, and hammered 3 rails into place. Nearly 2 hours for one short section, the rest of the fence still leaning beyond it. She almost felt disappointed until Isaiah asked quietly, "Could cattle pass through that section now?" "No." "Then it was worth doing." The next morning's line read split 10 logs. Not 30 as Daniel would have done, but 10. 10 finished logs warm a house better than 30 imagined ones, Isaiah said, and she split her 10 and stopped, not because she couldn't go on, but because the day's task was done. Instead of guilt, she felt something lighter. One basket of potatoes, one window shutter, one section of chimney. Small tasks, finished while everything else became extra. And within a week, finished work had begun to show up across the property, not because she was working longer, but because she was finishing what she started. Not every day went her way. 3 days of hard rain undid some of it. The roof leaked into the pantry. A hen went missing. A windstorm knocked down 2 rails she'd already repaired. "I knew it," she said when Isaiah found her staring at the damage. "I'm falling behind again." "How many rails fell?" "2." "How many have you repaired since I got here?" She counted. 12. "So you're still 10 ahead." She had only seen the 2 she'd lost. He'd seen the 10 she'd gained. That evening they climbed the hill behind the cabin and watched the valley turn gold under a setting sun, the mountains fading into purple beyond it. Isaiah pointed to a narrow trail climbing through the pines. Most folks complain about a climb like that. They rarely notice they've already left the valley. Clara looked back at the cabin, smaller than she remembered, the fence stretching farther than she'd realized, the woodpile fuller, the garden looking cared for instead of abandoned. The change had come so gradually, she'd nearly missed it. That night, she opened the map again and read the words beside the longest route. This time she understood them. Daniel hadn't admired that trail because it was hard. He'd admired it because every mile of it was earned the same simple way, one step and then another. She folded the map and set it beside her bed, and for the first time since he'd died, she slept through the night. Winter came quietly that year, without the fierce storms the old settlers liked to warn about, a little at a time, the way most hard things arrive. The first snow fell overnight, and when Claire opened the door the next morning, the broken fence and the weathered barn and the winding path to the creek all looked different under it. Not fixed, not finished, peaceful. Months earlier, the sight would have filled her with dread. Every task waiting under the snow, every responsibility she carried alone. Now she saw something closer to a beginning. The homestead was still far from perfect. 2 roof sections would need replacing come spring. The barn door still stuck in damp weather. The north fence still leaned. But the woodpile was full. The cellar was stocked. The chickens were secure. The accounts finally in order. And most of all, Clara no longer woke up believing she was already behind. She thought back to those first weeks when she'd mistaken the size of the work for the size of the journey, believing she had to rebuild an entire life in a single day. Isaiah had reminded her of something she'd forgotten. No one carries a mountain. They carry a stone, and then another, until one day they look behind them and find that they've built something. He stayed nearly a month before moving on, and never once took over. He held the post steady while she set it, sharpened the axe while she split wood, drank his coffee quietly while she worked the accounts. He didn't carry the trail for her. He only reminded her that she was already walking it. The morning he saddled his mule to leave, her heart sank a little, though she'd known the day was coming. Will you come back? She asked. Maybe, he said. And when she told him that wasn't a very comforting answer, he only smiled. Most trails don't promise where they lead, they just ask you to keep walking. Before he rode off, he pressed the leather notebook into her hands. She tried to give it back. This is your whole life. But he shook his head. It's my days. My life is everything that happened to me. My days are what I chose to do with it. Don't measure yours by the storms you've survived. Measure it by the steps you kept taking after. Then he rode away, and she stood by the road until he disappeared past the ridge, thinking about how different she was from the woman who'd sat alone on that porch months before. The circumstances hadn't changed completely. She had. Spring came with mud and more work than she expected. Broken branches, damaged posts, everything winter had hidden now laid bare. For a moment the old weight returned. The old voice, you can't do all this. She stood in the yard and felt the whole list forming in her mind again. And then she smiled, because she recognized the voice this time and knew it wasn't telling the truth. She went inside, found a scrap of paper, and wrote, Repair 3 fence posts, nothing else. By summer, people had started to notice. Not the work itself, but the change in her. The neighbors who passed no longer saw a widow struggling to hold on. They saw a woman who'd rebuilt a failing homestead and learned every trade it required, one small task at a time. Years later, people told stories about Clara Morgan's homestead, the strong fences, the healthy cattle, the bread she shared with travelers passing through. They said she'd built one of the finest places in the valley. Clara always disagreed, because she knew the truth of it. There had been no single day when everything changed. No grand rescue, no sudden burst of strength. There had only been mornings, hundreds of them, and on each one she'd chosen a small task and done it. Many years later, an old woman, now with silver hair and hands worn from a lifetime of work, she still kept Isaiah's notebook beside her chair, its pages fragile, the ink faded but legible. One autumn evening, a boy from a neighboring farm came by, sulking over a half-mile of fence his father had sent him to mend. I'll never finish, he said. Clara brought out the notebook and opened it to the first page and let him read a few of the short, plain entries for himself. Where's the part where he traveled hundreds of miles? He asked, confused. There isn't one, she said. He never traveled hundreds of miles. He traveled 1 mile, and then another. She closed the notebook. Nobody finishes a long trail by staring at the end of it. They finish it by respecting the next step. That evening she walked out to the edge of her property, to the same hill where Isaiah had once shown her the trail through the pines. The sun sank behind the mountains, the fields glowing gold, the fence line stretching across land that had become, over the years, something greater than either she or Daniel had ever imagined. Not through one heroic effort, but because every day she had shown up and taken the next step. The longest trail she had come to know is never conquered all at once. It's walked, one board, one stone, one morning at a time, by anyone willing to keep moving forward.